This is Jim Bish with the Americans in Wartime Museum. Today's date is March 29th, 2019, and I am conducting an interview with Jim Miller in Sun City, Arizona. Jim, would you please give me your full name and where you were born?
My name is James Miller. I was born in a small copper mining town about 70 miles east of Phoenix called Ray, R-A-Y, Ray, Arizona. And the town is no longer there. It was an underground mine when I grew up, and it expanded into an open pit when I was in high school. And about the time I graduated from college, the open pit swallowed up the town, and they built a new town called Kearney.
So you grew up then in Arizona all the way through?
Yes.
You're rare in this area.
Yeah.
So what year did you graduate from high school?
I graduated from high school in 1954.
Okay. And how did you find your way into military service?
I went to college in Tempe. At that time it was Arizona State College rather than Arizona State University. But I was there, and they had an ROTC program. I was in ROTC, and I enjoyed that. So I stayed in the ROTC and advanced ROTC and got a commission when I graduated.
And you will eventually, that commission will lead you into the Vietnam War, it sounds like, somewhere.
Correct, yes.
Your service.
Yes.
Where did you do your basic training at?
I went to Lackland Air Force Base, Texas, for about 30 days, kind of an orientation. Then I went to pilot training in Malden Air Base, Missouri, and then I went to basic training in Laredo Air Force Base in Texas, where I think the Air Force finally discovered they had too many people in pilot training, and they washed half our class out in the second phase, and I was one of those that washed out. But I enjoyed flying, so I went on to Nav School, and I graduated from Nav School and in Harlingen Air Force Base, Texas.
Okay, so you ended up as a navigator?
Yes.
Okay. What about when was that you
I
finally got out?
graduated from Harlingen in September 1960.
Okay. After you got out of Nav School, where did they send you?
They sent me to military air transport in Travis Air Force Base, California. And I was assigned to two different squadrons there. First I was flying C-124s, which was the big two-story type aircraft that could carry really large equipment, 4-engine recip. Went to the 85th Air Transport Squadron for that, and then they introduced a new airplane, new at that time, C-130, which they're still in service, and I transferred over to that squadron, and I was just about 2 years in C-124s, the aluminum overcast, and then the C-130 for about 3 years.
Okay. And when you were in the Air Transport Squadron with the C-130, what were you with? Were you with still with the 85th, 86th?
Yeah.
So you were with the 85th and 86th?
85th and 86th, correct.
Now, how big a cruise did those have?
Well, in the C-124, we had a loadmaster, 2 flight engineers, a navigator, and 2 pilots. And in the C-130, we had 1 flight engineer, a navigator, 2 pilots, and a loadmaster. So there was
6 and 5?
Yeah.
5 in the C-130 crew? And you were a navigator in both?
in both, correct.
In both? What was your job as a navigator? What are some of the things that you were responsible for?
In addition to just navigating, we participated in some paratroop exercises where we went to, goodness, where was it? Back in an Army base. Can't think of the name of it right now, but we would do paratroop exercises, and that was interesting because a lot of times the paratroopers would get sick on the initial part of the flight, and then they would jump out in their parachute. And in fact, one interesting story, one of the paratroopers that got sick had his bag that he had thrown up in, and he threw it on the loadmaster who was guarding the door when they went out. The loadmaster went out after him and beat him on the ground. So that was kind of interesting. It's the first time I ever heard of that happening.
Yeah, can understand that.
Yeah.
Yeah. When you were certainly between the C-124 and C-130s, probably sometime in there is when the Vietnam War started getting heated up.
That's correct.
When was that, and can you tell me about how that changed things, or did it change things for you?
We flew primarily, we were Travis Air Force Base, California. We flew primarily in the Pacific region. We would fly to Hawaii, Wake Island, Guam, the Philippines, and into Vietnam. We didn't stay crew rest. We would crew rest in some of the other locations. We did not crew rest in Vietnam. We would go on to Bangkok or come back to the Philippines or go up to Taiwan, and we'd go to Japan. So we got a lot of different islands in the Pacific that we went to. We went into Vietnam, mostly in Ton Son Nhut, in Saigon, and to Da Nang, which was further north. We also went into, I think it was Korat Air Base in Thailand, and we were the first plane to go in there since the Second World War. That had been an active base in the Second World War, and we were the first crew that went in there, and then they developed it into a location for bombing fighters going into both North and South Vietnam.
Very interesting. What types of, were you bringing personnel and equipment in, both, or just both?
Yeah, mostly equipment, but we could do both.
So when you were dropping equipment off and personnel in Vietnam, you unloaded, then got out of there extremely fast then?
Yeah, well, it was usually like a 2-hour ground time. Would offload, refuel, and sometimes would reload, and sometimes there wouldn't be anything for us to take. But one of the things that was really brought home to us the extent of what was going on is a number of times we would bring back caskets of deceased soldiers that, had met their end there and fighting in Vietnam, and that was really brought it home to us, the seriousness of what was going on.
What other kinds of things would you bring back when you did? Was it damaged goods or repaired, or what type of goods would you bring back? Do you remember?
I don't really remember. That was the thing I remember the most. And if we didn't bring something back from there, we might have picked something else up in another station to bring back to the States.
Yeah. Did you ever bring something from Vietnam to the Philippines or to Hawaii or to Bangkok or some other location to drop off, or was it primarily back to the States?
Usually back to the States, but that was we would carry goods for all the different locations that we flew into.
Yeah. When you brought personnel to Vietnam, was it primarily from Hawaii to Vietnam or all the way from Travis Air Force Base up to Vietnam? Do you remember?
Personnel was not from Travis. It was maybe, I remember there was one mission that they had two Army troops that were designed for R&R to Hong Kong. And they selected our crew to take them there. So it wasn't a regular stop. So they were to be there for 2 days, and we got to stay there 2 days waiting for them to finish their R&R, and that was really quite a nice thing for our crew. And we, that only happened one time.
Yeah. So their R&R turned into your R&R. That's good. That pretty rare, it sounds like.
Really.
So your main base was Travis Air Force Base then? Is that where you primarily worked out of
that's
to
correct.
make your Pacific runs?
Yes.
How long did it take to make your Pacific runs and be back at Travis after you left?
It was usually about 10 days. Over the 5.5 years I was there, we had a limit usually of 100 to 125 hours a month in our airplanes. And we'd usually get pretty much that. So in the 5+ years I was there, I got about 5,000 flying hours.
It's a lot of hours.
Yeah.
When you were approaching Vietnam, did you do anything differently on approach because it was entering into a war zone than you did anywhere else where you landed?
I don't recall anything specific, although obviously, we were in communication with the ground and radar approaches on occasion. So they knew who we were.
Yeah. Did you ever run into any incidents while flying into Vietnam?
Well, not specifically. We would, on occasion in C-124s, we would lose an engine, but it was a 4-engine airplane. Never had any really serious, and it wasn't necessarily going into or out of Vietnam that occurred, but nothing really associated with Vietnam that I recall.
Yeah. Now you flew some pretty big aircraft. What are some of the largest equipment that you brought in? Do you remember any of that stuff?
Oh, in the C-124, we could take in very large equipment. A tank or a fire truck would, a lot of airplanes were too short vertically to accommodate the bigger equipment. The C-124 would accommodate those nicely. The C-130 was not quite as big, but had almost as much weight carrying capability, but not quite as bigger dimensions.
Does a plane fly any different with that much weight on it? Could you address that issue? Some of those tanks, and so of course the C-120, they're so huge aircraft.
They would, if we had a heavy load, it would take us longer, especially the C-124. Sometimes it seemed like we were used the whole runway taking off.
Runways got awful short at the end, huh?
Yeah, yes.
But you always got them up in the air.
Never had a problem, no.
Never had any major issues other than losing an engine once in a while, and you were flying anywhere?
No, not really.
Who kept up your aircraft? Was that at Travis Air Force Base, or was every place you landed had a?
Each of the places that we went to had maintenance facilities that could take care of, relatively minor things and kept us going.
Yeah.
But the major maintenance was done at Travis.
Yeah. I'm assuming that most of the larger vehicles, such as tanks and things like that, were probably sent from Travis over there, or did you pick any of those?
Yes,
because
right. Yeah, there was one particular mission that I remember we didn't really know what was going on, and they just called us and told us to report to Travis Air Force Base. And we got on another aircraft, not as a crew member, and they ferried us to Norton Air Force Base in Southern California. And we met up with our airplane there. They had a C-124 that was loaded, and we went to Charleston Air Force Base, South Carolina. We still didn't really know what was going on. We got there and we crew rested. They had another crew that picked up our airplane and took it on. And when we finished our crew rest, which was 12 or 15 hours, I don't recall which, we went back out to base operations, and they had a television set there, and President Kennedy came on the TV and announced that they had discovered that there were missiles being put up in Cuba. And that was the whole thing, that the airplanes were taking equipment to Guantanamo. And we were the last, our plane was the last one to go in, but with another crew. And so we just took an empty plane that had come back and flew back to Travis. But that was
So you went into Guantanamo?
we did not. No,
You did not.
the plane did, but we
Okay.
dropped it off in South Carolina, and another crew
Took it in?
took it in.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
That was interesting.
but we
Never
didn't
been-
know what was going on
Yeah.
until we got to
Yeah.
South Carolina.
In the fall 60s. So how many years did you fly out of Travis then?
5.5 years.
And do you remember the dates, kind of when you was? you were
It
doing-
was, I think, towards the end of September 1960 when I got there, and it was March of 1965 that I left.
Uh-huh. And you said that it took you roughly about 10 days to leave Travis to make your circuit
Correct.
and then return. How much rest did you have before you were up in the air again, out flying again?
12 to 15 hours, usually 15 hours, crew rest on the ground. Sometimes we would stay with the same airplane, and sometimes if the mission was really important, they'd have other crews that would pick up the airplane so that they could get it there faster. But we usually stayed with the airplane.
So you were almost 2 or 3 times a month. You were
No, we were usually once a month.
once a month. Okay.
Maybe after, we'd usually get a crew rest back home of 10 days,
Okay.
10 to 15 days, and then we'd be scheduled to go out again on another mission.
Okay. So when you were back home, what were some of your duties when you were on your 10 to 15 days back home?
We would have to go in sometimes. We'd get usually 3 days totally off, and then we'd go in and maybe have some training of some sort, but we didn't have any real responsibilities or administrative duties. We were just, and we didn't have a crew. We didn't fly with the same pilots or same flight engineers or whatever. They just matched us up with whoever else was next
Available.
in line.
Uh-huh. So you flew with a lot of different people
A
then?
lot of different people, yes.
Were there a lot of different navigators at
Yeah,
Travis?
I can't remember really how many navigators or pilots or whatever.
They could composite a lot of different crews if they needed
Correct.
to.
Yes.
Did you live off base?
I did at Travis, yes. We lived in a little town called Vacaville, which was right on US 40, right between Sacramento and San Francisco. So we'd get a chance to visit either of those two towns occasionally.
Yeah.
Right after I got to Travis, my son, we got there in September, and my son was born in December, the end of December of 1960. Then I had a daughter that was born in September of 63. So those were the only two children I had, and
Yeah.
and they were both born at Travis Air Force Base.
So it sounds like you had a fairly, at least you were back home quite a bit of the time in your service.
Yeah, we did, and we were close enough to Arizona that, when I took leave, we were able to come back and visit family in Arizona.
Was your wife from Arizona? Or
Yes, she was. We went to high school together. We didn't get married till I was out of college, but
Sounds good. So were you discharged in 1965 then? Or
no,
were you?
In 1965, they had a shortage of munitions officers in the Air Force. So I was cross-trained. My major in college had been chemistry, and they thought chemistry sounded like munitions, so they cross-trained me into munitions. I went to Lowry Air Force Base, Colorado for tech school, and then I was stationed at Kirtland Air Force Base, Air Force Special Weapons Center, where they did some special testing of nuclear munitions. They had a variety of aircraft, B-47s, B-52s, F-4s, F-89s, and I think there were a couple others. I can't really remember now. Those are the main ones that they tested munitions. It was near Sandia Laboratories, who was part of the Atomic Energy Commission, and they did a lot of the design of that, and so that was the primary mission there at Kirtland Air Force Base.
So were you also Navigator on any of those things?
I
those skills
was still on flying status, but I would fly on a C-47 or C-54 for my flying time. But my primary duty was in munitions, in charge of the ground crews that loaded the munitions onto the aircraft, fighters and bombers.
So it kind of changed quite a bit. Certainly the aircraft that you were used to changed a lot.
Very much so, yeah.
Much smaller aircraft that you were on.
Well, not the B-52s and B-47s are pretty big aircraft.
Yeah.
But the fighter aircraft were obviously a lot smaller.
Yeah. Now, as you advanced, when you left flying out of the C-30s, C-124s and C-130s, what rank were you at that point?
I was a captain at that time.
And then when you moved into your other position?
I was a major. I was promoted to major while I was in Kirtland Air Force Base. And while I was there, then I was transferred then. I was there about 15 months or so, and I got orders to go to Vietnam. And we lived on base at that time. My family wasn't allowed to stay on base if I wasn't there, so they relocated to Kearney, Arizona. And while I was there, I got orders that changed me from, I think it was Phuket, which was a new base that was just being established in Vietnam. And they transferred me, or changed my orders to go to Utapao Air Base in south of Bangkok in Thailand. And I did go there. I spent about a week short of a year there, and there we were supporting the B-52s. That originally the B-52s came from Guam to do the bombing in South Vietnam and North Vietnam, and they built Utapao. They were still in the end of the development and phase of Utapau. They only had 3 B-52s there when I arrived in May of 1967. And as they expanded it, developing it, they got to 15, along with C-135s, which they used for refueling. And they had about 15 C-135s also. And I stayed there for a year. We would get the bombs, would come in either on truck, or sometimes they had a vehicle they called a Lark that was transported them. They'd download the ship into these Larks on the water instead of going into a port. And they would come up and we would store the munitions, and then they would tell us what their requirements were, and we would assemble the bombs. We had to put the fins on them and put the boosters and the fuses on them, and then we delivered them. I was in PACAF, and they had another munition squadron on SAC. We would deliver the bombs to them, and they would load the bombs onto the aircraft. And a B-52 would have 82 or 84 500-pound bombs internally, and another 24 750-pound bombs externally.
Wow.
So that was a large load of bombs. And we went through over 1 million bombs while I was stationed there in that first year.
So this was 1967 to 1968 in that time frame?
Yeah, 1 week short of a year.
And this was all in Bangkok?
South of Bangkok.
South of Bangkok, where you were doing,
Right.
You had a lot of different jobs while you were in the Air Force.
I did, yes. I was I was in charge of the loading crews. They didn't call it a squadron commander when I was at Kirtland the first time. I was a maintenance supervisor part of the time when I was in Thailand. Other times I was just a maintenance officer. I had a maintenance supervisor above me. There were 2 officers that were kind of out in the area where we did the operations, and then we had a squadron commander who was more up on the base.
Yeah.
And we had kind of an interesting experience one time. I went out and I was acting maintenance supervisor when my boss was on R&R back in Hawaii with his wife. And I went out, and there was a big group of GIs out in our little rest area, and they were making much more commotion than normal. So I went over to see what was going on, and there was a Thai out there that had a python. There was about a 10-foot python, and he had it by the tail, and the python was, trying to get away, obviously, and he steered him by moving around, and some of the GIs would get up fairly close, and I was afraid one of them was going to get struck. I mean, they're not poisonous, but
Yeah.
Still, I didn't want them to get injured. And so I went out there and I got them off. We had these Thais that worked with us, and they did some of the unpacking of materials and that sort of thing. The GIs did all the assembly,
Yeah.
but they would do the unpacking to allow us to put them together. And then they would carry off the crates and boxes and that sort of thing that things had been packed in. They'd carry them off in their own vehicles. So I told them to get out of here and get off base. So I saw them just 5 or 10 minutes later get on one of the vehicles and go, and I thought they were gone. I got a call about 10 or 10:30 from the squadron commander, who was up on the up in the hooch area, we called it, where the airmen were quartered, and he asked me if I knew what he had beside his desk. I said, "No, sir, I have no idea." He says, "I've got a snake by my desk." And he said, "We'll talk about that in a little while." I used to have to go in at noontime every day to discuss with him what was going on so that he could talk to the wing commander if there were any issues. And so when I went in at 11 or 11:30, I expected him to talk about that. He did not. And we just talked about what normal things. And then just as we were about to break up the meeting, he says, "Oh, by the way," says, "guess where that snake is now?" I said, "I have no idea, sir." He says, "Well, it's under the wing of the C-47 that goes to Bangkok." He had called, well, first of all, he had heard this commotion up on the base near his office, and he told the first sergeant to go out and find out what was going on. First sergeant came back and says there's some ties that have a snake. He thought the snake was dead. He told him to bring it in. They put the snake in a small box, and when the snake was alive, he's slithering around and trying to get out of the box. The box started creaking next to the squadron commander's desk. He asked the first sergeant, "Is that snake alive?" He said, "Yes." He thought it had been dead. So he called the wing commander. The wing commander was very pleased to hear this because he wanted to take it up to Bangkok and have it stuffed. So the wing commander was very happy. So he was very happy, so he wasn't unhappy with us anymore. And I guess that it finally got stuffed, and I never saw it or heard anything more about it.
Crazy. So when you returned back from the States after you almost did a year there, where did you go from there?
I went back to Kirtland Air Force Base again, but to a different job. And I was in a logistics command office at Kirtland Air Force Base, where we had various logistics command provides logistics being supplies. They are responsible for getting supplies where they needed to go in the Air Force. And one of the things that they did at Kirtland Air Force Base was they had the Directorate of Nuclear Safety. Again, because they had Sandia Laboratories and that sort of thing there, and the Atomic Energy Commission office. So they had a nuclear weapons system safety group where they studied the weapons and the integration of the weapon with aircraft. And so every time a weapon was associated with a different aircraft, they had to have this study group. And that would take a week to 2 weeks, and sometimes would be on trips to go see how they're deployed in the States and that. And my responsibility was to make sure that nothing was done that would impact the ability of logistics command to support the weapon system. So I did that for about a year and a half.
How long were you in after that?
About a year and a half. I was there for from maybe June of 1968 till 1970. Then I received orders to go to Hahn Air Base in Germany, and that was my first real job where I was responsible for storage of weapons and maintenance of weapons and delivery to the aircraft and loading on the aircraft and that sort of thing. On a TAC fighter squadron, F4 aircraft. And that was a kind of a unique experience also. When I arrived there, they were in the middle of an ORI, operational readiness inspection. And so I arrived and they told me to just stay in a hotel downtown for three or 4 days. My family came with me at that time. And I just stayed there until the inspection was over. And then they brought me in and kind of indoctrinated me a little bit. I was the ranking officer in the squadron, so I was the squadron commander, but I didn't have as much experience with the weapons and that sort of thing, the weapon systems, as the next lower ranking officer. So I had to learn quite a bit from him as we were, going through the various things. But they also, they failed the inspection, the operational readiness inspection. So they fired the wing commander, they got a new wing commander, and that wing commander was gonna change things. He fired every squadron commander, every maintenance squadron commander, the chief of maintenance, the maintenance that did maintenance on the aircraft, field maintenance, organizational maintenance, munitions maintenance, every squadron commander except the civil engineering squadron was fired, and I was one of those after about a year. So I was then transferred again to another munitions maintenance squadron in England. And so that was another interesting experience to go up there, and that was a special weapons storage area. And
What part of England was it at?
that was at RAF Alconbury, about 60 miles north of London. And that was very interesting. I think one thing we liked about there is that we could converse with the natives. In Germany, you dealt with, the Germans were not, most of them were reasonably friendly, but some were not so. But in England, the English were pretty friendly, and we were able to travel. We went to Scotland and different parts of England, Wales, and enjoyed it with the family. Got to London several times and enjoyed that also.
Then from there, did you make it back to the States again?
Well, while I was there, I was passed over from, I was promoted to what they call a temporary major. And then after you get temporary major, I was passed over twice for permanent major. And my son and daughter had been changing schools a lot. I would have had to stay on as an enlisted man, go from an officer to an enlisted. I didn't care to do that, so I was discharged, and I came back to Arizona at that time in January of '73.
So you were
No, December of '73.
So you were pretty much, that's just
That was
half a year after the Vietnam War ended. So you were in that whole time frame from Cuban Missile Crisis up through
right.
all stages of the Vietnam War,
Yes, yes,
and even before when you were doing your Pacific runs.
right. And in one thing that I did that was a little bit unusual too when I was still stationed with Military Air Transport Service at Travis. I volunteered to go to Antarctica on what they call Operation Defreeze in the spring, which is the fall down in Antarctica, before they can get the icebreakers in to do the resupply to Antarctica. They have Air Force bring supplies and personnel in from New Zealand to McMurdo. And so I went there 1 year for some training. Then I went to Arctic Survival School in Alaska, where we were out in the field for 3 days and 2 nights. It warmed up to 35 below zero while I was out there. And then I went down to Antarctica again for about 2 months in October, November of 74. No, 64. Yeah.
You had some interesting
I did.
places you went in your Air Force career.
I certainly did. I got to see a lot of the world and
Yeah.
Different experiences, and I enjoyed my service.
Yeah. Did your service help you when you got into the private sector? Any benefits?
I don't really, didn't find anything, really related except for kind of management, and I never did really get into management that much after I got out of the service. I was looking for a job, obviously, and I went into real estate for a couple of years, and I wasn't really a sales-oriented person, so I went back to school on the GI Bill. I got a degree in accounting. One of the elective courses I took while I was in that, I had to take some electives in other business, and one of them was in purchasing, and that sounded good to me. I was doing a little bit of purchasing. I worked for the state of Arizona for about 3 years, and part of my responsibility was purchasing for the agency. And then I got a job with Honeywell, where I was doing purchasing of components. They were just converting from electromechanical type instruments in the cockpit to all electronic instruments for the displays for the cockpit. So that was interesting in that it was new and rapidly developing, and I enjoyed that very much. And I first started doing some mechanical components that were still being used, but then I got into electronic components, memory, integrated circuits, and microprocessors, and they were changing so quickly over time because they were, new at the time also.
Yeah.
And it was a challenge for engineering and purchasing to be able to keep up with the changes in the components that were available, because our volume was not as high as a lot of other uses of electronics, computers, and that sort of thing, and we didn't have near the volume that they had.
Yeah.
So we had to coordinate with the engineering and enable them to keep buying the upgraded components and keep our equipment going.
Keeping up. Yeah, that was the electronic age hit. It's computerized circuit breaker, circuit systems and all
Right.
that.
Yeah.
It's hard to keep up.
Yeah. very much so. And I worked for Honeywell for almost 20 years, and then I retired in '98.
Okay. Well, thank you for your interview.
Well,
thank you for your service
Thank
to
you
your country, and
for,
thank you for your interview.
having me. It was kind of nice to recall some of the activities that I had, and it was certainly something that I don't have any regrets about.